times of yore, the 5th and 6th console generation, directors and various other creatives from the world of film turned their hand to video games. Some of the more well-known examples of the time were Spielberg acting as a creative consultant for the Medal of Honor franchise, Peter Jackson collaborating with game director Michael Ansel for King Kong, or the Wachowskis creating new footage exclusive to the Enter the Matrix game. Even jumping ahead around a decade, many of us will still remember how Kojima was set to work with Guillermo del Toro for Silent Hill, or even John Woo's involvement in Stranglehold. While those are a little tangential in terms of collaborating with the studio, there were occasions when a film director had a more prominent involvement in a game. Take, for example, Kinji Fukasaku, a Japanese film director and screenwriter who directed Clock Tower 3. Or, as I want to take a look at now, film director Hayashi Kaizo's involvement in the 2001 Konami video game 7 Blades. So, what happens when you take around 20 core developers, a film director who has no history of game development, and decide to make a sequel to a film that's over a decade old and no one outside of Japan has probably even seen, let alone heard of? Well, you get 7 Blades, of course. Let's kick things off with taking a look at the film which would go on to inspire the game. The premise of Zipang is that the bounty hunter Jigoku Gokurakumaru and his crew discover a map that tells of the fabled island of Zipang, a lost city of gold ruled over by a golden king. Jigoku sets off to the island pursued by a female bounty hunter, Tokugawa Ieyasu's head ninja Hattori Hanzo, as well as a strange resurrected warrior who all have their sights set on the mythical island. Directed by Hayashi Kaizo, Zipang slots into the tokusatsu genre of films. The term is quite broad. If I say films like Godzilla, Kamen Rider or the Super Sentai series, they all form tokusatsu subgenres. From a Western perspective, just imagine the vibe of the Power Rangers, lots of explosions, primitive SFX, and creatures in flimsy costumes that make them look like they're waddling around the house trying to find toilet paper. The creative connective tissue between Zipang and 7 Blades is quite fascinating. Though the game acts as a sequel, it's more like Hayashi Kaizo, who directed both the film and the game, deliberately selected certain elements to bring into 7 Blades, a chronology, a few characters, antagonists, but then remixed them into a game which isn't so much a straight up sequel, but more in the realm of a game that has been reborn but still retains memories of its past life. If you don't care about the film or its relation to the game, you could skip to the 7 Blades section via the chapter select or head to the timestamp on screen. Turning back to the film, Zipang draws on aspects of Japanese mythos that, while it has ties to the West, may not be well known. I'll brush over the film in order to dig up some of the more interesting historical points. It'll also help give some sort of context to the game itself. 7 Blades plays out like a fever dream in some parts. Firstly is the introduction of one of the protagonists that we'll see appear in 7 Blades, Yuri the Pistol, or Teppo Oyuri as she's called in the film. She's a sassy bounty hunter who's accompanied by her brother Kikamaru. The two want to hunt down Jigoku in order to, well, you can imagine. Funny thing about her name is that the kanji is that of the lily flower, but also the same kanji used for the Yuri genre of literature. You can Google that on your own time. Obviously, Oyuri wields a pistol. Given the year the film is set in, towards the end of Tokugawa Ieyasu's life in the early 17th century, we're not quite at the point where the country was totally closed off. Guns, mainly the Teppo rifles, had been around for 60-ish years. I'm no expert, but Oyuri's weapon looks like a matchlock pistol that may have been altered or probably fabricated for the film. Funnily enough, she reminds me of Nohime from Sengoku Basara. As for the other protagonist, Jigoku Gokurakumaru, we meet him and his crew soon enough. We can interpret his name to mean Hell's Paradise Maru, given that the Jigoku is Hell, Gokuraku is Paradise, and Maru is often affixed to warrior names. Also, the name may ring a bell if you watched or read the manga Hell's Paradise. The Gokuraku in that title literally pulls on the Buddhist interpretation of a Shangri-La-like location. Though if you're familiar with the series, you'll know it's anything but. Banger of an intro song with Shina Ringo though. Finally, introduced to Jigoku, he's surrounded by a small army of bounty hunters after his head. He's famed for using 7 swords, which, for no other reason than looking cool, fly out of the air and land in a circle around him. Each weapon is different, from your standard katana to twin daggers to even a rapier. A number of these will crop up in 7 Blades along with some newer variations. The bigger and more bombastic combat scenes are front-loaded in the film. A couple of the standouts are the fight in the village that sees Gokurakumaru take on hordes of enemies. I love how no one enemy looks the same. You've got bandits and monks and even a French soldier popping up. The other impressive scene is the single take of the battle on the big bridge. The camera slowly pulls back while Gokurakumaru scythes through countless black-clad enemies. Some of the enemies will even end up appearing in the game, if in a slightly modified manner. After all the battling, you get a good look at Gokurakumaru's crew, consisting of Wee Man, Sideshow Bob, Super Mario, a coked-up accountant, and Dumbo's meth-addicted cousin. This is where they learn of a hidden treasure, the Shishisto sword. The blade is believed to be Korean in origin due to the branch motifs and had been a gift from Pachi to a Yamamoto ruler. In Zipang, the blade is pure gold and has appeared in a number of Japanese games and other media. You may know the name from Tenchu 1 and 3, where the Shishisto sword was wielded by Meo and was imbued with mystical properties. It was also wielded by Uesugi Kenshin in the Samurai Warriors games, and of course it's the weapon wielded by the Divine Dragon in Sekiro. In stealing the sword, Gokurakumaru resurrects or awakens a strange Mayan-looking warrior. He'll be back later on. After Jigoku meets up with Oyuri in a failed attempt to bring in the bounty, you meet one of the antagonists of the film, Hattori Hanzo, who looks like he's dressed in a bin liner. The binocular cum messaging device that he uses will also be strangely reinterpreted for the game in a rather baffling way. The film also introduces Tokugawa Ieyasu, Marco Polo's diary, and a solid gold crescent. Tokugawa Ieyasu is probably one of the most famous shogun of Japan. He was the first after all. Given that in Zipang he looks pretty chipper around the beginning of the film, but is then on his deathbed by the end, we're joining him at the end of his life. He has a copy of Marco Polo's diary which tells of an island 1500 leagues east of Cathay that is abundant in gold. While Tokugawa has no need for wealth, he could always do with godly power. The message from Hanzo telling of a sword that can open the way to Zipang is all the encouragement he needs. The golden jewel that Tokugawa possesses is actually a Magatama. If you've played Onimusha, you will have picked up a few of these jewels in your journey. They are typically beads hailing from the final Jomon period to the Kofun period, 1000 BC to the 6th century, while seemingly decorative and then being used for ritualistic purposes. In Japanese folklore, the sun god Amaterasu used fragments of a Magatama to create various other deities. While there's no definite consensus on the shape, it's said to represent a number of things from the moon, a fetus, the soul like yin and yang, and more. Back to the diary and Zipang, similar to the legendary city of El Dorado, it too was said to be a land abundant in gold. Its name was derived from the Chinese name of Japan. Along with Marco Polo, the Mongolian king Kublai Khan allegedly sent an army to conquer the island, but a storm destroyed the expedition. According to Dr. Murakami Ryu, director of the Takaoka Art Museum, Polo could have been referring to Hiraizumi, located in Japan, due to the vast amounts of gold mined there. The explorer probably heard a bastardized story from rumor or a traveler he spoke with, as he never visited Japan. Years later, Columbus would set off in search of Zipang. I don't think he found it though. Tokugawa tasks Hattori Hanzo to locate the city. Another prominent historical figure, Hanzo's often portrayed as a ninja, though he was a samurai and general. An expert tactician and blade master, he slowly transformed into a ninja thanks to the popular culture of the 1950s. If you played the Samurai Warrior games, you'll know the character, but the name Hanzo has become shorthand for either a ninja or skilled Japanese warrior in a number of works. To open a way to Zipang, all three groups clash: Jigoku and Oyuri, Hanzo, and the tattooed guy in the underpants. Oyuri and Hanzo are whisked off to Zipang via a giant aerial vacuum, leaving the tattooed guy and Jigoku to figure out a way to reach the fabled land. In Zipang, Hanzo fights a number of strange Mayan-like warriors, ultimately coming off worse for it. Oyuri meets the Golden King of Zipang. After rejecting his advances, she's locked up in a river where she's screamed at by a woman. Then, when playing the flute, she meets the Queen of Zipang, who's locked away in an ice cavern. The Queen rewards Oyuri with a bracelet for her flute skills so she can return to the real world. Hanzo isn't so lucky. He's tortured and loses his hand before being cast back to Japan. After rendezvousing with Gokurakumaru and fighting off some of the strange warriors, the tattooed man attempts to battle the giant stone golem wielding the Shishisto. Ultimately, he is literally gutted, and even Jigoku is no match for it. Later convalescing, Jigoku puts the moves on Oyuri, which seems to do the trick. Then everyone, including Hanzo with his new arm, flies off to Zipang. Here, there's a big bust-up with Jigoku's side, facing off against the hordes of Zipang's warriors. It culminates in a battle with the Gold King. Jigoku's able to defeat him, allowing the tattooed man and the imprisoned woman to reunite for good. Zipang starts to turn into gold dust as everyone flees. Jigoku and Oyuri, plus some others, survive, drifting on a raft, earning some well-deserved rest. Hanzo, meanwhile, snagged the Shishisto sword and returned to Tokugawa. only for the blade to have either rusted or turned into worthless stone. However, Tokugawa seems indifferent. The true Zipang was love for one's country or another. That's pretty much the moral, and that's pretty much the summary of Zipang. Now, NIPPUNK. I am copywriting it, trademarking it, applying for the patent. But seriously, while playing Seven Blades, it struck me that there was no particular word to describe the kind of genre aesthetic present in the game. It's one I'd seen before, not just in games, but in anime films. And I thought, how do you best describe these types of games set in the past that often feature anachronistic technology? Steampunk, dieselpunk, that doesn't quite fit. These monikers and the others in the punk genre don't quite capture this particular punky flavour. To wind it back just a moment, what is punk as a genre anyway? The example of the naming convention is of course cyberpunk. Pioneers of the genre like William Gibson and his seminal work Neuromancer, as well as other authors such as Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash and Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Your Blade Runners, Ghosts in the Shell, Johnny Mnemonics, also a Gibson story, are quick visual shorthand for the genre. Without delving into cyberpunk itself, the naming convention comes not only with a certain visual aesthetic of that high-tech, low-life society set in the near future, but also explores certain themes. A seemingly grim augur of the future, cyberpunk works often tackle artificial intelligence, transhumanism, the perils of technology, usually with a noirish twist. So let's bring it back to NIPPUNK. The name is a genius combination of Nippon, another name for Japan, and punk. However, this little digression isn't the place to speak about the greater thematic elements within NIPPUNK. You'd need an entire video and more than some cursory research, but I think I can outline what I'd generally categorize as NIPPUNK. We'll stick with the game sphere, but I'm pretty confident that this can apply outside of it too. To conjure an image in your mind in addition to the ones on screen, think of games like Onimusha, Tenchu, Sengoku Basara. I'm setting the time frame for NIPPUNK from the start of the Sengoku period, the mid-15th century, all the way up to the end of the Edo period in 1868. Oftentimes, the punky nature of the portmanteau is represented in the tech we see in these worlds, anachronistic weaponry or technology that either shouldn't be possible in that time period. It's kind of similar to steampunk, but that's a little too futuristic and gives a very British impression. It's also kind of dieselpunk-like, but again, that genre is somewhat too advanced and has that 50s vibe to it. Its closest neighbour, but what I wouldn't quite say is the same, is silkpunk. Coined by author Ken Liu, you can see silkpunk in the Grace of Kings book, which I read around the time of its release, as well as his other works. In my mind and in others, a visual representation would be something like Avatar or potentially Genshin Impact. Silkpunk has its own aesthetics and themes which I'd say are distinct enough to be separate from what I'd call NIPPUNK. On Ken's blog, he even outlines his definition of the term, and off the top of my head, what I'm categorizing as NIPPUNK would differ enough as to have its own moniker. Think of any bit of Japanese media where some robot-like mech pops up at a time when people wield katanas or matchlock rifles. Sengoku Basara, or Demon Kings as it was known in the time of the West, features this. So does something like Tenchu and Shinobido to a degree. This tech's usually in the hands of the enemy, which tend to be demons. Thematically, you could say it's a representation of the perceived danger of the outside forces around that time in Japan. During the Sengoku era, of course, you've got every daimyo popping off to unite Japan, but there were also the Korean Namban forces, China, the Ryukyu, the Portuguese and the Dutch. It also increased up to and beyond the Edo period. Yeah, so there is that rebellious punk component. A little coincidentally, these forces are often demons or gods and spirits of some kind. However, that kind of culture runs through Japanese folkloric history, so I won't put too much stock into it. Without serious exploration, it's only really possible to lightly sketch the outline of NIPPUNK rather than actually codify it. Even still, I thought it was worth a mention, and thus NIPPUNK is born. You're welcome. We're finally ready to actually talk about the game. As I touched on when talking about Zipang, Seven Blades both is and is not a sequel. It is Schrodinger's game. It both takes place after the events of Zipang, but at the same time reuses and reinterprets its characters, locations and story. It tells the tale of Jigoku and Oyuri. However, events don't take place around the early 1600s. Instead, we're transported to its midpoint. While the Tokugawa shogunate still exists, Ieyasu has long since passed away. Both protagonists become embroiled in a conflict between the Bakufu, the shogun government, the Dutch and a strange religious cult that has ties to mystical automatons on the island of Dejima, which was once a trading port. Seven Blades feels like a bit of an anomaly, developmentally speaking, for a number of reasons. One was, as mentioned, the director of Zipang, Hayashi Kaizo, acted as the game's director at KCEG, Konami Computer Entertainment Japan East. Well, technically direction supervisor, according to an IGN preview. In addition to Zipang, Hayashi is probably best known for Shiritsu Tantei Hamamaiku, which revolved around a private detective, and Cat's Eye, which was an adaptation of the manga of the same name and looks pretty ballin'. His more noir, hard-boiled films do ooze a lot of that 90s Tokyo cool. His supervisory role would not quite be on that level of autonomy though. The role itself is obviously pretty rare in the industry, more so these days than ever. Game directors are comparable to film, TV or documentary directors in terms of their creative sway and output. It's easy to think of heavy hitters like Kojima, Sakaguchi, Barlog, Hennig and tons more who've been behind some of the most accolade-ridden and revered games in the industry. At the time of Seven Blades, and I'm using air quotes here, actual director being involved in the game was somewhat novel. Hayashi's aim was to inject Konami's game with a cinematic flair made possible by the PS2's cutting-edge hardware. It certainly wasn't going to be an easy task. The team consisted of just 20 developers and would have a development cycle of around 2 years. While Moby Games lists a number in excess of that, and even that's not gospel, we can be generous and say that the core team may well have been around 20, and other staff hopped in and out when required. In the game's manual, which is an absolute pain to read by the way, Hayashi shared his creative intentions. In turning to the medium of games, he wanted to create a piece of art that could surpass the borders of Japan and contain universal appeal. In addition to this, the medium allowed him to create a branching story path, which isn't really possible in a show or film, with a few notable exceptions. In a preview with IGN, Hayashi and producer Atsushi Horigami were said to both understand that the gameplay must come first, and the game players will find that the title is a movie with some very deep action gameplay elements. We'll understand why that's certainly a take soon enough. In Next Gen Magazine issue 68, producer Shinsuke Mukai says that Seven Blades is very similar to Tomb Raider and Tenchu. Throw into this mix Blake Fisher's, the article's author's, comment. These similarities are easy to spot. You control characters from a third-person perspective and navigate through huge 3D levels fighting off enemies. It is such a broad take, he might as well have said that baseball and the scene from Casino where Joe Pesci's character gets mercilessly tenderized by mob goons is similar because they both feature round objects being struck with a bat. That may be a bit hyperbolic, but come on. And the thing is, Tomb Raider and Tenchu, though I love them, are not games I think of when I conjure an image of competent controls and skillful combat. The article also boasts about being able to render 20 enemies on screen at once. If this were the PS1 days, that'd be quite a feat, but as we saw with Dynasty Warriors 2, it wasn't quite the feat Seven Blades wished it was. Makai also claims that there will be puzzles to solve and passages where you must hide, Tenchu style, to progress. For the former claim, yes, there are puzzles in the most rudimentary sense, Pokemon boulder shifting level of brain teaser. For the latter point on stealth, I'm not calling Makai a liar, but having played the game, I didn't experience any form of stealth gameplay. What I assume is that the game was probably still going through a degree of development and some elements were eventually scrapped. But what was the reception to the actual game? Like a brew that you've forgotten about on the kitchen counter for about half an hour, the critical reception for Seven Blades was lukewarm. Released in Japan on December 21st, 2000, Seven Blades sits at around a 65% on game rankings. In today's climate, it would have probably been lower than that. Official PlayStation Magazine reviewer Steve Merritt bestowed it with a 6. He praised its diverse level designs, more so in mechanics than actual visual style, but found its camera controls a hindrance where its more action-oriented levels drag their arse. Put a specific pin in that final thought. The Japanese magazine Game Criticism Volume 37 has a number of interesting points to bring up. One is that Hayashi was influenced by MGS, Ronin Blade, hey I made a video on that, Biohazard and Tenchu, hey I made several videos about that. He's got good taste. The latter two, Biohazard and Tenchu, had a more profound effect on him during development, which we're able to see. According to Ganda Yumeto, the article's author, Seven Blades has exhilarating action, multiple fun weapons, and scything through enemies a la Berserk or Dynasty Warriors is a lot of fun. Praise also comes for the game's cutscenes, which are actually rather decent. However, the article does read more like a fluff piece, with the biggest critique being that the overall length of the game may feel a little short, which is more of a blessing than a curse. Lastly, Play issue 73 ultimately lands Seven Blades with a 46%, citing its mostly linear levels and poor graphical fidelity, but does mention that bright spots include the variety injected into a number of the game's levels and the occasional flash of Oyuri's knickers. Maybe the latter bumped up the score a few points. Seven Blades is at times both baffling and intriguing. For every confusing gameplay decision, there's another which brushes against meta commentary or a subversion of expectations. It both does and does not relate to the film that serves as its narrative bedrock. Seven Blades is a beat 'em up, and Mario Party and Time Crisis and that bit in Metal Gear Solid where you crawl through a hallucinogenic river before Kojima did it. And I'm gonna say it's in no small part thanks to Hayashi. Sometimes when you bring in someone who has no concrete experience in the games industry, it's like a toddler who whips off their soiled nappy in the middle of a restaurant and just starts swinging it around while screaming. They choose not to follow the rules because they don't know they even exist. Take the game's intro for example. Seven Blades strives to create a vibe and intrigue rather than concretely setting up what the hell the game's about. You know there's a bunch of ninjas riding giant flying shurikens. If you've not seen the game's case or read the manual, you may be forgiven for believing the main ninja will be Seven Blades' protagonist. For some reason, these shinobi want to attack a giant golden dragon. One of them blasts it in the mouth, and they go to great lengths to obliterate an island. You are probably left with more questions than answers. Then you look at something like Onimusha, which was released in the same year. Our antagonist, Oda Nobunaga, is introduced. Then it's clear Samanosuke is the protagonist. A princess is kidnapped. Samanosuke means to rescue her, and look, Nobunaga's back from the dead. It's like a log line in a pitch deck which sums up the film in a few sentences. In Seven Blades' case, it's like Hayashi tore the page out of the climax of the script. Sure, it's confusing, but it leaves you with questions. Questions that will probably pile up during the game itself. With a dual protagonist approach, you only gain a full understanding of the narrative by playing through with both Jigoku and Oyuri. The former's portion of the game sees you focus more on close-range action combat, while the latter is handgun based. Just as in Zipang, the film the game is based on, Jigoku is your rambunctious swordsman who eventually has access to the 7 blades that have made him the target of bounty hunters. While you'll be drip-fed the blades as the game progresses, you do start at least with a couple that the game will run you through in its tutorial. Jigoku has access to normal combo strings, a special attack which changes based on the equipped weapon, a jumping attack, a kick, and a dashing shoulder barge. In attacking enemies, Jigoku will build up his limit break of sorts, allowing him to unleash a powerful special attack useful for clearing enemies. You start off with a standard katana with a thrust attack, as well as a boomerang-like scimitar, both from the film. When playing as Jigoku, the moment-to-moment gameplay has a Final Fight or Streets of Rage vibe, though the addition of a somewhat primitive lock-on system like into Ocarina of Time's Z-targeting, you can zone in on one particular enemy. However, due to the hordes of enemies you're pitted against, it's rarely useful outside of boss battles. Once you've gotten to grips with the controls, you'll be introduced to the main thrust of the game's narrative. A golden dragon has appeared near Nagasaki, a city on the northwest coast, on the island of Kyushu. During the period the game set in, Nagasaki was a hub for international trade. Historically, Sakoku was still in effect. Lasting from 1603 until 1868, Japan's trade with the outside world was extremely limited. Their main partners were China and the Dutch East India Trading Company. There was also the presence of the Portuguese. However, we'll learn why the presence of the Dutch and their clogs is the most important out of the three soon enough. In Nagasaki, Jigoku meets up with Oyuri, his gunslinging love interest, and Togizo. The latter is the only one of Jigoku's crew to survive from the original film. It's his duty to chuck Jigoku weapons stored in the wicker basket on his back. Both Oyuri and Jigoku have heard the tale of the Golden Dragon. While they're gearing up to investigate, the cops break in an attempt to stop them. Amongst a rather crazy array of weapons like giant hammers and spiked bats, the police have a jite. Back then, if you brought a bladed weapon into the Shogun's palace, you had a literal death wish. As a sort of workaround, the jite was invented, though I'm sure hitting the Shogun hard enough with a giant hammer would probably be just as effective as a katana. Technically, you could catch or hook an opponent's sword if you blocked the blade first and then twist it out of their grip. Some even had blades hidden in the hilt. The jite, as well as a weapon, also functioned as a official law enforcement ID, kind of like if the American police force had their badge number engraved across the barrel of their pistol. Jigoku also gets his official brigand weapon, a giant horse-slaying sword. While the katana is more of a one-on-one weapon, the scimitar is best utilized for distant opponents. This new blade is your crowd clearer. Similar to Guts' weapon for Berserk, Jigoku laboriously swings the slab of steel around kind of like an infant trying to use a golf club. In busting through the inn and into the streets, you'll have noticed that, similar to Dynasty Warriors or Streets of Rage, enemy corpses tend to transform into various culinary dishes. Seven Blades Manual claims there are 60 types of food items, all with varying effects. Most recover health at differing percentages, others charge your special bar, while some even bestow various buffs and debuffs to your character. Whether you gain hyper armor or become frozen in place or even have your health decreased, you won't know until you stick it in your mouth, just like our ancestors. What's kind of disconcerting is that every time you guzzle down soup or some foreign object into your mouth, there's a slight delay both before and after. Obviously, it leaves you vulnerable to getting attacked, meaning you have to time your heals a la Souls-likes, but this was technically before that, and I'm drawing a blank on which games had a slight penalty for healing. Either way, it's one of those moments in Seven Blades where I'm not sure if it's an intended, seemingly ahead of its time mechanic, or just a development oversight. It won't be the first nor the last. Defeating the head of the police, who has no info on the dragon, introduces one of the game's antagonists, Hattori Hanzo. Present in the original Zipang, Hanzo fluctuates between main and secondary antagonists throughout the game, just like he did in the film. However, Jigoku or Oyuri don't seem to know Hanzo despite having encountered him in the film, and Seven Blades being touted as a sequel. Plus, the manual even says that they've crossed paths before. You then have a scene reminiscent of one in Zipang where Jigoku fights across a bridge which collapses. I don't think you could actually outrun the bridge. Chances are one of the annoying ninja will spring out of nowhere and hit you. To remedy this, you can make use of the compass in the top right of the screen, as well as displaying enemy locations. It'll also point in the direction of your current goal. Fine for outdoor locations, but as soon as you're in a more claustrophobic environment, it ends up becoming a hindrance. Thankfully, if you've got a companion traveling with you, indicated by their presence above your health bar, they'll often chirp at you where to go, unlike other games that may feature a companion. One of the positive mechanics Seven Blades possesses is that when you heal yourself, you'll also heal your companion. Running through the streets of Nagasaki, often getting knocked in the head by an off-screen ninja, actually taught me one of the most important lessons about Seven Blades. Though it may look like it, this is not an action game, and treating it like such will only frustrate you. Seven Blades is an interactive film, Hayashi said so himself. Wailing on enemies and racking up your kill count, aside from a health refill every 100 kills, provides no other tangible benefit. There are no skills to upgrade, there's nothing to unlock. The sooner you realise that the aim of the game in the majority of levels is to simply make it to your destination, the less frustrated you'll become. Enemies often continually spawn. The deeper you get into the game, the more each enemy hits like a truck, with hits devouring over half of your HP. Enemies exist to provide food and on some occasions act as a progression gate, and sometimes gates act as gates, like the one at the end of this level. When the trio are on the waters, the Golden Dragon tries to Moby Dick them. Jigoku ends up on Dejima's beach just as one of the giant shuriken crafts is on a bombing run. Stopping to admire the full moon or fight the ninja is futile. If you haven't noticed already, another nail in the action combat coffin is that you hardly do any damage. Taking on enemies often feels akin to leveling up your woodcutting skills or whatever it is in RuneScape. Dejima also introduces its next set of antagonists, a strange cult filled with zombie-like followers, the classic monk with a basket on the head, another guy with an axe who breathes fire, and one more who's a member of a KISS tribute act. Incidentally, he was also in the film. Jigoku soon stumbles on a strange woman who seems to have some recollection of him before finding himself in the middle of a ritual. This sets up the main antagonists of Jigoku's story, an unhinged priest and the Dutch. They are working together under the cult of gold in order to resurrect a giant golden warrior discovered on the island. The priest, which the manual dubs Oracle, was once a member of the imperial court who was banished for their anti-shogun sentiments. To give some slight context without delving too deep, the shogun acted as the de facto military leader of the country, holding immense power. Samurai reigned at the top, and the strict hierarchical structure made for very little social mobility. Sakoku closed off Japan, meaning there was economic stagnation and heavy taxation. So it's obvious that critics would arise and quickly be stomped out. Trying to resurrect a golden idol to completely eradicate the shogun and people of Japan is a little extreme, however. The priest get-up could easily be confused with what Shinto priests wear, however, I believe it's what is known as a sokutai. At the time, it was a traditional outfit worn by high-ranking nobles in the Japanese imperial court. Fashion aside, you do actually come face to face with the golden idol. Of course, there's no way you can damage the golden behemoth, so it's one of those killing time boss battles before Jigoku decides that discretion is the better part of valor. Further cementing its genre as more of an interactive movie, you turn up in one of the game's many bland corridor-like environments. Your mission is, again, to make it from one side to the other, while a bunch of zombified cultists repeatedly groan, basically, I don't want to die. I don't know what it is, but every time a game has some variation of I don't want to die, it always reminds me of House of the Dead 2's voice lines.
I don't want to die.
Owing to the smaller development team budget and the fact that Seven Blades was originally going to be a PS1 game, its environmental design is often extremely bland and basic. You're often traipsing through bland, repetitive environments devoid of any character. So much so, at times it's like some liminal space or backroom simulator. Again, you may say low budget, I say ahead of its time postmodern deconstruction. Another aspect of the game that I grew to appreciate is Seven Blades' approach to boss battles. They're often drawn out and frustrating, but they never hold your hand when it comes to figuring out a boss's weakness. While not overly complex mechanically, you're never quite just embracing a slugfest like two drunks going at it in a pub car park. Take the shadow fight, which crops up a number of times in the game. I assume the ninja is affiliated with the Oracle. He looks an awful lot like Hanzo. You often have to wait for him to delve into the shadows and then emerge. Using your radar, you can divine where he is and go for the strike. What's great is that you can cheese it by just sticking to a corner and playing whack-a-mole. Beyond the deserted street, you find the woman from before held captive by a couple of ninja. For the past couple of encounters, you've had none of your weapons and even your original katana is broken thanks to the Golden God. It was at this point I started to comprehend just how much damage enemies can inflict on you, not to mention one of Seven Blades' more unforgivable mechanics. Your super attack leaves you vulnerable to be hit, so in that small charge up time before unleashing a limit break, you're open to getting stabbed. Don't know if it's a bit of genius or not, but it did make me more considerate when I chose to unleash all that pent-up energy. Jigoku finds out the woman's name is Himika, which the manual refers to as a harlot, by the way. It's also the leader of the ninja who captured her. Oracle then turns up and mistakes us for dogs of Shogun or Bakufu no Inu. You're forced to fend off cultists while Seven Blades introduces its vulnerable companion mechanic. You'll now be tasked with protecting Himika for the rest of the game. She has her own health bar and will attract aggro from enemies. Thankfully, Togizo turns up and you've got your weapons back plus a new one, a double-bladed katana. It has a whirlwind-like special attack that can blow enemies away and works more as a offensive and defensive weapon. The Golden Dragon soon turns up and lays everything in its path to waste. Jigoku gets a better look at the woman, though is still not clear of her intentions on the island. Himika, Jigoku and Togiza then flee across a level which is set up more like a game from Takeshi's castle. You then have to dodge boulders and your new companion loves nothing more than sprinting headfirst into a giant rocky ball as soon as the level begins. It's a nice change of pace. Seven Blades tends to fluctuate between these gimmick-like levels and its slightly more traditional action-focused sections, kind of like WarioWare or Mario Party. The next level is equally bizarre as you're in some kind of underground temple. While you have to make it to the other side, you're at odds with the hordes of riflemen and swordsmen who will pick you off as you try to leap across platforms. It's annoying, but in a bafflingly amusing way. Ultimately, I think it was the right way to handle the game because its action combat certainly can't stand on its own. Seven Blades is very much, if you can't be great, at least be memorable. After surmounting the stairs and facing off against Shadow again, you find Oyuri's pistol, and I'd honestly forgotten about her, so I wonder how she's doing. In another Takeshi's-like stage, or that downhill cheese run they have in England, you and a bunch of enemies are bolting down a hillside. Jigoku leads the female ninja again, who says that Oyuri is holed up in a nearby trading house. We can probably take a minute to just give some context to what exactly Dejima is or was. Off the coast of Nagasaki lay the artificial island of Dejima. It was a trading post of the Portuguese during Sakoku. Then the Dutch came to make use of it. During the Edo period, it was the only part of Japan open to foreigners. Basically, it was the Tokugawa shogunate wanting its cake and eating it. You could have traded with the outside world, but they weren't technically stepping foot on proper Japanese soil. Though abolished in the 19th century, it still exists, but has been folded into Nagasaki itself. These days, it's classed as a historic site. Because of its purpose as a trade hub, Jigoku is of course in a trading house looking for Oyuri. You gain a new weapon, a rapier-like blade that can scorpion get over here enemies. While useful for the extremely tight corridors and walkways of the trading house, it barely does any damage and is generally quite a useless weapon outside of very specific circumstances. The main crux of the trade house is to wander the various drab rooms, activating switches and pumping the female ninja for information about the island. Allegedly, a priestess was said to have dwelled on the island. I assume they mean not the island itself, but whatever could have been part of Nagasaki before then. The female ninja wants to protect the ancient one, which is why she came here. The Oracle guy wants to be able to use the golden armor in order to control the dragon and destroy the shogunate. Ultimately, you reach the building's roof and meet one of the leader of the Dutch trade organization. I'm assuming it's someone from the Dutch East India Trading Company. However, at the time, I don't think they had ruffs, the neck covering that doubled as a helicopter. If the guy sneezed, it'd probably take off his chin. In a rare moment of almost comical violence, Propellerhead, as Jigoku calls him, just dumps the woman. Jigoku gets all pissy with the ninja because he feels she's acting rather indifferent to the demise of the Ancient One who she swore to protect. You're soon in one of the game's most frustrating battles against a bunch of the propeller guys who will swoop down, stab you, or launch bombs. It's a fight requiring you to really be on your toes and cheese the boss with that scimitar boomerang. This one took a fair few tries and a lot of messing around with the weapons to find the right combo. One thing I'll say about Seven Blades boss battles is that yeah, they can be janky and frustrating, but there is a sense of accomplishment. It's like successfully completing your shopping trip with a cart that has a busted leg. Of course, the body the Flying Dutchman tossed aside was the fake. The real Ancient One is being held at the brothel. Chances are Oyuri may be there too, so Jigoku chooses to accompany the ninja. Himika, however, isn't too happy with Jigoku getting all chummy with another woman. It seems to be playing into the Oracle's plan, however. In the brothel, you get one of the best, let's say, circumstantial weapons in the game. If you've ever seen an anime, manga or film where there's a one-strike attack, the blade is essentially the embodiment of that trope. In Japanese, there's the Itoryudan, which is to cut in two with a single stroke. This blade is most probably based on the Iado martial art. Within that discipline, there's a word, Iaigiri, which is to kill with a single stroke, which is basically what this weapon's limit break is. Its special move, however, is extremely useful for dealing high damage, the highest, I believe, in a single stroke. There are these really annoying spiders in the brothel that will stun you if they hit. You're constantly making like a rabbit and hopping through the liminal space hallways like it's an episode of Scooby-Doo. Himika is extra clingy, even managing to solicit some strange memories from Jigoku before being left behind in a room. Eventually, Jigoku finds Oyuri dressed as a geisha, though it ends up being a trap. Jigoku's transported to the start of the game, battling against Oyuri. Now, I thought Seven Blades was really subverting my expectations because you can't kill the bandits or Oyuri in this level. So I thought, maybe because it's a dream, I have to lose. The game even says you can't win. Okay, I have to die then, right? Well, I did that, but it was the same old continue screen. No special cutscene or anything. I know. I have to choose not to continue. Very meta. So I do that, and then it just boots me back to the start of the brothel level, and I have to do it all again. Well then, what do you think the correct way to complete this section is? If you said jump off a gap in a ledge, you'd be correct. Why you have to do that specifically, I have no idea. It works. You're then back in the brothel, face to face with the Oracle and a bunch of giant spiders that have Himika's face on them. Apparently, she's the key to whatever ritual is happening here. You're then fighting a bunch of spiders aided by the ninja and a giant golden idol. We then discover the ninja's name is Ayane from the Ancient One. However, she's already been kidnapped. What's worse is that the Golden God bursts in and brutally kills Ayane. Say what you want about Seven Blades, but it will often surprise you with some of its narrative turns, and it's not just contained to Jigoku's story. The Ancient One warns that attempting to defeat the Golden God may well turn Jigoku into a demon himself, but with Hanzo soon to arrive, the god can't fall into another's hands. Luckily, he may have some help. Oyuri flashes back into existence as the island is under assault. While she wants to flee, Jigoku wishes to stay and fight. He sets off alone into the night past burning buildings to a final showdown with Shadow. A frustrating battle because your weapons never quite seem to do consistent damage against bosses. Sometimes the Shadow will take a ton of HP damage, other times barely anything. Thankfully, the fight can be cheesed by baiting Shadow into the corner to limit the places he could spawn after emerging from the Shadow Realm. Shadow will reveal that Jigoku's past life has something to do with all the shenanigans on the island, though you'll have to wait a little longer for a clearer answer. Jigoku finds Himika and the Oracle, with the former being burned at the stake. Fujin and Raijin, the literal gods of thunder and lightning, have even appeared to hold Jigoku back, but he's not alone. Oyuri's sniping in a nearby guard tower. While the fight certainly is possessed of a deeper battle mechanic, Raijin calling forth lightning and Fujin flying about the level, the Fifth Blade's ability to churn out an often insane amount of damage makes it trivial. Its special attack will shave off about 1/3 of their HP, while its limit can take off nearly 3/4. In response to being cheesed, Fujin attempts to drown Oyuri while Raijin looses one last lightning bolt, seemingly killing Oyuri. Meanwhile, the Oracle's ritual is complete. In burning Himika, the Golden God arises. It absorbs her into itself and then transports Oyuri to the Shadow Realm, leaving behind only a giant sword. The Golden God dips and you're left to take out your anger on the Oracle. Acting as the last boss in what's been a 3-boss rush, it's the most deceptively frustrating. The Oracle will deploy an army of his paper charms that will constantly zip in for chip damage. Along with this, he'll also be able to charge up a special attack that will rip a number of stone pillars from the ground. Oftentimes they're used to protect the Oracle, or they'll be launched at Jigoku. The first phase of the boss is fairly simple. You can literally just keep running up and slashing him with your new weapon. It's the latter half where things get a little trickier. This is in large part due to the game's camera. You can swing it around with the rear shoulder buttons or have it snap back behind your character with L1, but due to its slow nature, when you want to quickly turn around or get a good look at what's behind you, it's painfully slow. That's especially frustrating, say, when you want to dodge a number of massive projectiles coming your way. This is why the second blade is your best friend when the fight enters its latter half. You can keep yourself out of harm's way while continually flinging the weapon at the Oracle. Again, there's no standard or best way to tackle any of the boss battles in the game, but I do like how 7 Blades often leaves it up to you and your arsenal of weapons to work out a battle plan that's best for you. With the Oracle's death, Jigoku has his sights set on the dragon. However, Hanzo's full-scale assault on Dejima has just kicked off. The ancient golden city has just appeared from underground, spitting out strange mechanical automatons from its mouth. Jigoku's tasked with rushing through the battlefield in order to reach the temple with the branched blade protruding from its peak. The design of the temple itself almost looks Mayan or Aztec, which mirrors the look of Zipang. It's inhabited by strange warriors wielding primitive weapons and bird-like masks. Giant cogs roll around with expressions on their faces like someone just kicked them in the balls. In an elevator level reminiscent of the likes of Final Fight and Streets of Rage, which always seem to feature these on your way to the big bad's lair, you're fighting an onslaught of enemies to reach the top. The design of both the temple, its inhabitants, and the strange technology the Shogun has access to is all part of the NIPPUNK I talked about before. That anachronistic blend of tech that is unmistakably Japanese and doesn't quite fit with already established terminology. It was certainly one of Zipang's defining features, and it's even more present in 7 Blades. At the temple's peak, Jigoku finds that Himika is within the warrior. The strange woman she transforms into, who says she's been waiting 1300 years for him, is somewhat similar in design to the one that appeared in Zipang. Meanwhile, Oyuri has been encased in the red eye of the dragon as it shoots off into the sky. Himika wishes to destroy Japan with Jigoku's help, beseeching him to abandon Oyuri and remember his past. Jigoku then becomes pretty philosophical on the nature of love before facing off with the Golden God.
永遠の命だの。寝ぼけたことばっか抜かしやがって。花パーッと咲いてさっと散るからめでられる。時期外れの花。狂い咲きって言うんでい。
And this is the battle that broke me, by which I mean I actually dug out an old action replay CD and entered some cheats for infinite health. Surprisingly, they actually worked. After fighting this thing ad infinitum, I just wanted off the ride. Again, it was an instance where I thought the game was getting smart, asking the player to think beyond mindlessly wailing on an enemy. The number of pillars around the level can be destroyed by the boss. When they do, they fall over and cause a fair bit of damage, breaking the glass. Seeing as though your attack barely scratched the boss, I was like, oh, I need to destroy the pillar myself so that it crashes down on the boss, thus damaging its health. Did not work. Then I thought, but when a certain pillar crashes down, it smashes the glass to the outside. What I need to do is break the glass, then kite the boss around so that when it does its rush attack, it will fall below. Not that either. The secret to defeating the boss is chip damaging it to death, and that takes forever, and it hits like a truck. It's an awful, laborious fight. You barely tickle this thing. You can't attack when its shield is in the way. You can knock it down while rushing forward, but then can't follow up with further attacks. Your limit breaks also barely do anything. Unless there's something I'm missing, it is an awful, boring fight. So I just turned on the cheats, whipped out the all reliable 5th blade, got as close to this thing as possible, and probably figured out the way of doing it legitimately. You basically get close to the god's shield and use your special move. It looks like Jigoku is repeatedly whacking his head against its shield, but it shaves off more HP than anything else you can do. In the end, you do that, I don't know, a few dozen times and you'll have defeated the Golden God. Unfortunately, you've neither saved Oyuri or Japan. The dragon will explode in an underground volcano, causing Japan to be swallowed by the sea, unless you can defeat Himika. You then have the game's true final boss, Himika herself. You're basically dodging lightning bolts and energy balls to hit several copies of herself until she coalesces in the center of void space. Do that enough times and you'll have completed the game and finally gain some context on what the hell's actually going on. In ancient times, Jigoku, or Jigo as he was once known, served Queen Himika in a past life. Their village was assaulted, causing the queen to flee. They obviously had some kind of romantic relationship that was cut short when Jigo perished. The mirror Himika was given by Jigo allowed her to access a lab where the Golden God was stored. With it, she controlled the dragon and rained havoc on the attacking forces. She then swears to wait for Jigo's return. All that led to this moment. The present Jigoku chooses not to kill her, instead pitying her loneliness before she passes away. Now, of course, the whole place is gonna blow, so Jigoku escapes on a flying shuriken ship to meet the true last boss of the game, Hanzo. A little unexpected and a little pointless. Hanzo has been sidelined for much of the game, in contrast to how he was in the film. The battle reminds me of the fight in MGS where you battle Liquid on top of the downed Metal Gear. It's not meant to be a serious test of skill, more like the final exhalation of air to bring the plot to a close. In the end, Dejima and the ancient land is totally obliterated. Only Jigoku and Oyuri and Togizo have survived to literally walk off into the sunset. So that brings Jigoku's story to a close. It's mostly siloed from Oyuri's and remixes plot threads and characters from Zipang to a greater degree. To brush over some of the discrepancies, in Zipang there was a separate character that was the resurrected lover of the Queen. However, in Seven Blades, the Queen is an amalgamation of one of the warriors from Zipang and the imprisoned Queen. The Golden God is essentially the Golden King and the giant mech that he pilots. The Seven Branch Sword still exists in spirit as the final blade Jigoku requires, and though most of his companions haven't survived the cut, Togizo has. Finally, while Hanzo is still present in the game, kind of occupying the same side antagonist role and foil to Jigoku, he's taken more of a back seat. As I touched on before, Jigoku's story is part sequel and part reimagining of Zipang, which ends up being a slightly baffling journey. Maybe Oyuri's will be easier to digest. Oyuri plays much differently to Jigoku. With a name like Oyuri the Pistol, you can imagine what her arsenal is going to consist of. Because you're no longer diving into the throng of battle, instead hanging around the outskirts, you can consider her scenario as the easier version. It's somewhat similar to how Chris and Jill's tour of the mansion was represented in Resident Evil. The intent of having two characters was to explore different narratives and add replayability to the game. I also think it was heavily inspired by the aforementioned Resident Evil. Beyond the split narrative, you've got the zombie cultist vibe and the entire game ostensibly taking place in a single location. It's kind of like Code Veronica ahead of the curve. Along with being able to wield guns, Oyuri has access to a dodge ability, a first-person viewpoint, and the ability to mount ledges in order to gain the advantage on enemies. I can certainly applaud the effort to make Oyuri's experience unique rather than a rehash of Jigoku's playthrough. It kicks off the same. Oyuri's the one at the restaurant this time fighting the bounty hunters. Her main weapon, the pistol, is actually the best weapon in the game when it's upgraded. You'll find various others at your disposal fairly early on. Gatling guns, rifles, grenade launchers and shotguns. The Gatling gun requires you to plant your feet as you shower foes in bullets, acting as your designated crowd clearance weapon. The rifle is powerful but slow, functioning more of a, slower, more powerful pistol. The grenade launcher can cause major damage over its blast radius and is best suited for bosses or tightly packed enemies. The shotgun works best in confined spaces like the hallways you'll find yourself roaming through. The pistol comes out on top because of its consistency and the various upgrades you can find on your adventures. You can find extended mags and eventually an add-on which essentially allows you to infinitely fire the weapon. Combine this with your ability to rush around while firing indiscriminately, and it's the most effective gun in the game by, a long shot. The assault by the Golden Dragon acts as the spot where Jigoku and Oyuri plot threads fray. While he was washed up on the beach, Oyuri finds herself captive to the zombie cultists on Dejima. Fortunately for her, the bounty hunters from before, eyes set on Dejima's riches, have also infiltrated the island. It's at this point the game tries the same tricks as with Jigoku's story. You're weaponless, but technically Jigoku could still stab stuff. Oyuri can only launch explosive pellets at enemies, making for rather hilarious if frustrating gameplay. However, Oyuri's playthrough leans more into those Tomb Raider and Resi influences more heavily than Jigoku's more straightforward adventure. Levels are more built around the adventuring side of the action-adventuring moniker. You're often making use of her ability to surmount ledges to navigate around obstacles or find various switches. While playing, I thought the game may have actually worked better by integrating both sides of gameplay. Oftentimes, when games do this, it can feel somewhat forced or not very compelling, but because the character gameplay is well-rounded enough, it's more Onimusha 3 than, say, that part in Resi 2 Remake where you play as Ada. Oyuri's story pays a little more focus to the cult side of the narrative and its specific goals. Like Jigoku, she also picks up a straggler, who they find buried under a pile of corpses, by the way. I could understand Oyuri's willingness to take charge of the girl out of general human decency, but in Zipang, she actually has a brother. He's never mentioned in the game, by the way. You also get more background on the bounty hunters from the start of the game. While they are a ragtag bunch of goofballs, through Oyuri's story you learn that they turned to their life after losing their families through war. They further prove their competence when a couple of them actually wish to forget about the supposed riches of the island, determining their lives are more valuable. Of course, the lure of wealth ends up being too strong, and you and them are all off on an adventure together. A number of levels and locations do mirror Jigoku's, but there are several that differentiate themselves. There's a kind of sniper gauntlet on the way through an abandoned town. Snipers line the houses and streets. If you just try to leg it, you'll be made into Swiss cheese, so you must edge forward, picking off threats one by one. The run through the underground lair is made somewhat more tolerable because Oyuri has a better jump range and, shooting things from afar is easier than having to get within stabbing range. Likewise, this goes double for boss battles. In most instances, you can happily put yourself far out of harm's way because bosses tend to lack range. The trade house is a similar affair and mostly a chore, but the narrative does take a rather baffling twist. Even though this place is full to the brim with people that want to kill you, after arriving in a room with a bath, Oyuri decides now is the time to take a dip. Of course, it's not a regular bathroom, but a lab overseen by a mad scientist. You're then embroiled in a pretty amusing battle where this scientist creates little replicas of himself that run around like it's the Puppet Master films. They're mere distractions as you try to defeat the alchemist, who often hides behind lab equipment, kind of like the Fat Man fight from MGS2. The boss is able to pull off matrix dodge moves if you're too close, so you watch him prance around the lab like a villain from the 60s Batman TV show, spitting out these strange barks. When the battle ends, and as the dude's face burns off, you hear your newest companion mention Jigo for some reason. Whereas Jigoku's time in the mansion concluded at the roof, Oyuri's ends in the ballroom. Her bounty hunter friends had previously been captured and seemingly forced to dance until they dropped by a manic Dutchman. The premise of the boss battle is that Calavera wields a variety of guns, dual pistols, and a rocket launcher that appears out of his navel. I can only imagine every time Calavera wishes to reload, he has to awkwardly work a rocket the size of his fist up his arse, but Hayashi was too cowardly to include that. Also making matters worse is the dancing Sabermen. If you end up shooting or knocking into them during the fight, they'll join in too. If you're not careful, they can quickly overwhelm you. The best general course of action is to bide your time, dodging gunfire until he preps a rocket and then destroy it just as it's launched. Unfortunately, all that dancing came at the cost of one of the trio's lives. No longer a threesome, it's just the leader and the monk-looking guy left. While they're bickering about leaving, the young girl's jade amulet flashes, beckoning them somewhere. You follow her instructions out of the house's grounds, where a bunch of the Sabermen are fleeing something. Necklace still aglow, the girl leads Oyuri to the brothel, where a golden sword is stuck into the floorboards. The bounty hunters, intent on digging it up, run off to find some tools, while Oyuri soon becomes entranced by a kimono. Obviously, she decides to wear it and is then possessed. The gang leader suffers some kind of acid trip where he's seeing double before slaughtering his friend, and then yelling for Oyuri to strip. Then, and this wasn't on my bingo card, you're forced to fight like 100 horny dudes, mercilessly gunning them down while they catcall you. Resident Evil wishes it had that kind of gameplay. Suddenly, Oyuri snaps back to reality to discover that it was all a trick of the mind. She killed the final member of the bounty hunting crew. Haunted by a voice claiming she revels in death, Oyuri rushes down the brothel's hallways until locating its source, a mirror. Then you're fighting a mirror. Functionally, the boss battle is the same as Jigoku's throwdown with Shadow. Having a gun makes the entire process much more trivial, as it's easy to turn on a dime compared to the clunky katanas. While Mirror dies, Oyuri is now all alone. Thankfully, she soon finds the girl, who pushes them both down a well. At this point, Seven Blades decidedly turns more resi than Jigoku's DMC style, especially when Oyuri gives the girl some water and it turns into a giant face-melted sperm monster that chases you down a cavern. A nightmare I'm sure we've all endured at some moment in our lives. Oyuri is then facing off against the Orochi and their children, but it's seemingly unending. She's then helped by a mysterious stranger who gives her a pistol. Armed, she finds her way back close to where the blade was driven into the floorboards. It turns out to be the ticket that transports her to Jigoku's side, which is where the pair rendezvoused in his side of the story. Though Jigoku wants her to hang back, we know that she ends up joining him for the fight against Fujin and Raijin. Seven Blades actually handles this in a really cool way. Using the first person, you're basically sniping them from a tower. Maybe this is another MGS influence from when Snake was fighting Sniper Wolf. To step back and look at the game's graphics and character models for a moment, they do look nice. Though the models have obviously been up-res to a degree because of the emulator, characters aren't unpleasant to look at. I believe Hayashi was trying to capture some of the visual diversity in Zipang. In Jigoku's fight with the bounty hunters when we first meet him, there's just such an array of unique-looking bad guys with different styles that it activates some pleasure center in my brain. Seven Blades does somewhat capture this, with smatterings of well-modeled characters. It's just once you journey deeper into the game, you'll be sick of staring at the same Sabermen, zombie cultists, and ninja. The game also strives to at least make enemy variety somewhat varied, albeit in fits and bursts. From crows to spiders to sentient paper charms to fire-breathing cultists to weird Orochi, it sufficiently shakes up gameplay compared to, say, the half a decade or so beat-em-ups it's modelled on. With Oyuri's story, we discover where Himika transported her to, some creepy underground lake. The young girl is here, but Oyuri is also joined by Hanzo. This mirrors their pair's fate in Zipang. There, the two found themselves in Zipang together, though their stories never intersected. Now you're mowing your way through hordes of Orochi and their offspring in order to rescue the girl. Hanzo's alliance was only temporary, however. He grabs the girl and spirits her away. Incidentally, Oyuri also comments on Hanzo's arm, which he claimed was lost to the dragon 6 months ago in the opening cutscene, but in the original film he lost it being tortured by the warriors of Zipang. Oyuri's left to her own devices to escape, hopping and rolling through various traps in order to find the original entrance to the ancient factory. This was the same entrance that Himika had used over a millennia ago. It's guarded by giant automatons. You have no choice but to eradicate every single one, a task made easier by the fact you can pick up Oyuri's best accessory. While it claims you don't have to reload your weapon, it basically bestows you with infinite ammo. You then discover the factory's true purpose. It extracts gold from seawater. It kind of ties into the real history of the land. There was a period that Japan extracted a ton of gold from it, so much so that it dramatically fell afterwards. At the time, there wasn't the equipment to mine it from the seabed. An old man who appears out of thin air tells them it dates back to over 2,000 years. His name is Genai. He works for Hanzo and therefore the Shogun. The old man also chucked Oyuri a pistol a while back, so that was nice of him. And wouldn't you just know it, the child's name is Himika, obviously the very same one from Jigoku's tale, though she's obviously younger here. In a flash, she bolts up and flees with Hanzo in pursuit. Genai lets on that she's part of an ancient civilization with technology that far surpasses ours, yet was easily destroyed by some primitives with spears, but you can ignore that. You're then treated to the most Tomb Raider-like experience so far, scaling a number of platforms with patrolling enemies. Oyuri flips a switch to open a door below, which leads to the Golden Dragon's lair. Just like Western legends, the dragon hoards gold, or more specifically, it feeds on gold in order to power itself. Hanzo wants to use the girl and by extension the dragon. Oyuri refuses to let him, so it's time for another battle. The fight with Hanzo can be cheesed somewhat if you have the new attachment. With it, you can basically force Hanzo into a corner where his flips and ninjutsu are less effective. Then, while constantly bombing about, firing your pistol, Oyuri can effectively shave off his HP. The thanks we receive for saving the girl's life is for her to be possessed and drag Oyuri into the dragon's maw. This is how she became trapped in the eye of the beast we saw from Jigoku's perspective. Just before getting stuck into the final battle of Oyuri's tale, I do think it's worth talking about the game's cutscenes. For Hayashi, nailing these from a visual, graphical and directorial perspective served as a key pillar. It was, after all, the PS2, that general era of high graphical fidelity that really allowed games to become truly cinematic from a traditional perspective. Sure, you had Kojima's NGS, Square's Vagrant Story and perhaps Silent Hill that we could say were ahead of the curve in terms of their cinematic presentation. Compare that to the PS2 era and it really popped off. And when I say cinematic game, I'm not talking about being immersed in a world or a story or CG cutscenes. I'm specifically zeroing in on how it presents itself in engine. MGS is obviously the most notable example from the 5th gen. Then we move to the 6th, and you've got further MGS games, Final Fantasy, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Ico, and more. Games that really pushed both gamers and those too high on their snobbish horses to be able to reach a controller to slowly accept it as a valid artistic medium. So when we take into context those aforementioned games and hold them side by side with Seven Blades, is there anything that stands out? Elements that make you say, there's something a little beyond what I expected here. For me, who's probably a Philistine about all that stuff, not really. I can pick out some shots which I think are nice, they've been playing through this, but there isn't anything beyond the scope of what was already being done by game directors at the time. In fact, I think Hayashi's greatest contribution has nothing to do with the CG cutscenes and may lie somewhere else. But for now, I'd say it's obvious by the very nature of the game, a large emphasis was placed on Seven Blades in-engine cutscenes and the CG, with particular bright spots being on how comedy is handled and the general animation benchmark it sets. Swinging back to Oyuri's final battle, and it literally takes place in the belly of the beast. Himika basically turns Jigoku's spirit that's taken on his form into the Golden God. Oyuri's about to blow a child's brains out when the big beast steps in. It's a fight with a distinct Resident Evil 2 boss vibe, specifically the one against Tyrant Mr. X on the lift. The Golden Warrior will lumber about with an absurd AoE on his ground stomp. If he gets in close, he'll pound you in the face, while you can slowly chip away at its health. In Resi fashion, you have an RPG of sorts available. The golden bow-looking thing is actually an ancient bazooka. It takes a while to charge, but when it does, it shaves off a fair chunk of the giant's HP. Unfortunately, you're not just battling against the Golden God, but the game's camera. Because the AoE has such a giant effect, Oyuri's often knocked on her arse when trying to reach the ancient rocket launcher. You have to constantly keep the camera focused on your back in order to provide enough time to reach the weapon. Then Oyuri hoists the thing up. Finally, you pray the jank aiming allows you to actually hit the target, and that is the true final boss of the game. Yes, it's frustrating, but I did breathe a sigh of relief when it had finally sent the last round into the warrior and accidentally blew a hole through a small child. While not as clear as Jigoku's story, you can kind of piece together that the ancient warrior Himika and the child have some kind of connection. God help you if you played through Oyuri's story first. The dragon then takes off on its own, while filling in a few narrative gaps. Of course, the small girl was Himika the queen. Jigo was a commoner, so their relationship couldn't be, even though she's like, I don't know, 12 in the cutscene. So yeah, best not, eh? I know you don't need to go into the comments and say that 2,000 years ago in a fictional civilization that was actually encouraged. The dragon crash lands, and who should turn up to drag Oyuri out of the wreckage but Jigoku. Once again, they're walking off into the sunset. While playing Seven Blades, at certain points, I was asking myself if many of the game's mechanical and creative decisions were by design or just an oversight. You could say that at the time, Japan had more of a reputation for experimental games, at least from a Western perspective. Think Mr. Mosquito, Live Alive, and Boku no Natsuyasumi. As time and development costs marched on, outside of the indie space, these kind of games decreased. Seven Blades isn't your typical action game because it's not an action game, and that was Hayashi's intention. I think he wanted a bit of everything, like Zipang, a big dome adventure where it's more about engaging in fun distractions as you barrel your way from cutscene to cutscene. Think about it, by 2001 we already had Dynasty Warriors 2, Onimusha, Devil May Cry, and MGS Sons of Liberty. These games found their niche and became what we could consider tentpoles, whether it's a senseless brawler, peak character action, or reactive stealth that goes beyond a traditional gaming experience. While I struggle to find any concrete information on the extent of Hayashi's creative involvement, it does capture a childlike sense of, why don't we do this, and then this, without being constrained by typical game design rules or expectations. Obviously, it comes at a cost. The story is convoluted and can be difficult to pass. The janky action gameplay and oftentimes punishing enemy damage is not enough to support the game. Environments are bland and uninteresting corridors, but the switch up in how you interact with each stage does just enough to hold your attention during its 2-hour or so runtime. In the end, while Seven Blades is not something I'd rush to recommend, it stands as an interesting bit of media that attempts to remix a rather unknown film and turn it into a game. As such, it finds itself in an ambitious niche that would only become harder to occupy as the console generations marched on. In fact, I kind of miss it. Thanks for watching.